My name is Jimmy. I'm 69 years old, and I want to tell you about the night my daughter-in-law looked a waiter dead in the eye, pointed at me, and said, "He's not really family, he's just my father-in-law."
My name is Jimmy. I'm 69 years old, and I want to tell you about the night my daughter-in-law looked a waiter dead in the eye, pointed at me, and said, "He's not really family, he's just my father-in-law. Put his meal on a separate check." The restaurant was quiet enough that 3 nearby tables heard her say it. My wife, Carol, went very still beside me. My son, Danny, stared at his plate like it had suddenly become the most interesting object in the world. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply nodded at the waiter and said, "That's fine. Separate check is fine." What none of them knew, what Danny himself didn't even fully understand yet, was that 6 weeks earlier, I'd quietly co-signed a $340,000 business loan that was, at that exact moment, the only thing standing between my son's restaurant and total collapse. I hadn't told anyone. Not Danny, not his wife, not even Carol. And by the time that dinner was over, I'd made a decision that was going to change all of our lives within the month. Stay with me, because this isn't a story about anger. It's a story about what happens when you finally stop quietly propping up people who've decided you're disposable. I spent 39 years working in commercial food distribution, trucks, warehouses, the unglamorous machinery that gets produce and dry goods onto restaurant shelves before anyone notices it happened. I built a regional distribution company from a single leased truck into a business that, by the time I sold my controlling stake 4 years ago, supplied over 200 restaurants across 3 counties. My son Danny grew up around that business the way kids grow up around anything their parents build. Half proud of it, half embarrassed by it. The particular tension of a kid who wants to seem like he came from nowhere rather than admit his father's calloused hands paid for his childhood. He was a good kid, genuinely. Sharp, funny, restless in a way that made me nervous even when he was small. He didn't want to inherit a distribution company. He wanted to open a restaurant of his own. Something sleek and modern, the kind of place with a tasting menu and a wine list longer than the food menu. I supported that. I want to be clear about that from the start. Because this isn't a story about a father who resented his son's ambition. When Danny was 29, I helped him open his first restaurant with a modest personal loan. No strings, no interest, just a father wanting his son to have a real shot. It did reasonably well for a few years. Then he met Priya. Priya is sharp in a way that initially impressed me. She'd worked in hospitality finance before she and Danny married, and for the first year or two, she genuinely seemed to bring discipline to a business that had been running a little loose. I liked her, honestly, in the beginning. It's only looking back that I can see how her particular kind of confidence slowly hardened into something colder, something that started treating generosity, mine especially, as an entitlement rather than a gift. I want to walk through how the distance grew because I think it matters more than any single dinner. It didn't happen all at once. It happened the way most of these things happen. 100 small recalibrations that, looked at individually, seem almost too minor to mention. It started with holidays. For years, Danny and Priya hosted Thanksgiving at our house, the way it had always been since Danny was a kid. Then, gradually, the location shifted to their place, which felt natural enough. Until I noticed that Carol and I were increasingly seated at what Priya once, without any apparent self-awareness, called the overflow table, a smaller table set up near the kitchen, while the main dining table sat reserved for what she referred to as actual family, meaning her side, her parents, her siblings. Then came the restaurant itself. Danny had opened a second location 18 months earlier, a bigger, more ambitious space downtown, financed partly through a bank loan and partly through Priya's family connections. I noticed over time that I was rarely invited there anymore. Not excluded exactly, just quietly uninvited from the kind of casual family dinners that used to happen weekly. When I did visit, Priya had developed a habit of introducing me to her friends and business contacts as Danny's dad, rather than anything warmer. A small linguistic distance that, on its own, meant nothing. Repeated enough times, it started to mean quite a lot. The comment that finally made me pay real attention came about 4 months before that dinner. Carol had overheard Priya on the phone with her sister describing our family's upcoming visit as having to deal with Danny's parents this weekend. Not cruel exactly, just carelessly dismissive. The kind of comment people make when they've stopped considering whether the person they're talking about might eventually hear it. I have to ask you something because I think it's the real question sitting underneath this whole story. Have you ever watched someone slowly redraw the boundaries of what counts as real family? One small comment at a time, until the redrawing becomes so normalized that objecting to any single instance makes you sound thin-skinned rather than perceptive. That's the particular trap of this kind of slow exclusion. There's no single moment cruel enough to justify a confrontation. Just an accumulation, and a growing quiet certainty that something has already shifted underneath you. Here's what almost none of them knew, and what makes everything that follows make sense. About 6 months before that dinner, Danny came to me privately, without Priya, looking more shaken than I'd seen him in years. The downtown restaurant, the ambitious second location, was hemorrhaging money. A construction delay had pushed the opening back 4 months, burning through the initial capital reserves. The bank loan he'd taken out required a level of collateral and creditworthiness that, on paper, he and Priya together didn't fully meet. Not after the original financing had already been stretched thin, covering the delay. He asked me, quietly, almost ashamed, whether I'd be willing to co-sign an additional business loan, $340,000, to keep the downtown location from defaulting entirely and potentially dragging the original restaurant down with it. He told me he hadn't told Priya he was asking me. He said she'd insisted repeatedly that they didn't need my help, that her family connections alone would be enough to carry them through. And he was terrified of what it would mean for their marriage if she found out he'd gone behind that insistence to ask his father for a rescue. I said yes. Not because I owed him anything, and not out of some desperate need to stay relevant in his life, though I won't pretend that thought never crossed my mind. I said yes, because he's my son. And because 39 years in the food business taught me exactly how thin the margin is between a struggling restaurant and a closed one. And I didn't want to watch him lose something he'd worked hard to build over a pride he didn't even fully control. I asked for one thing in return: discretion. Not credit, not gratitude, not even acknowledgement at family dinners. Just quiet. I told him I didn't want Priya to feel like her husband's success was propped up by his father, because I understood, even then, that her sense of self was tightly wound around a story where she and her family were the primary architects of their success. I signed the paperwork, I told Carol eventually, but no one else. Danny kept his word. Priya never knew. The dinner where she made that comment happened almost exactly 6 weeks after I signed those loan documents. It was Carol's birthday. A modest celebration at a mid-range Italian restaurant Danny had chosen, ironically, because it was one of the very restaurants his distribution relationships I'd helped him build years earlier, still supplied. The evening started pleasantly enough. Then, over appetizers, Priya mentioned with visible pride that the downtown location had just posted its first profitable month, crediting it entirely to finally getting our financing structure sorted properly, no thanks to anyone else's interference. I glanced at Danny. He stared at his bread plate. When the check arrived, Priya picked it up, glanced at the total, and then, without any particular malice in her tone, which somehow made it worse, said the words that opened this story. He's not really family. He's just my father-in-law. Put his meal on a separate check. I think she genuinely believed she was simply being financially precise, drawing a clean line around who belonged to her immediate family unit and who was, in her mind, a peripheral guest. I don't think she intended it as the gut punch it landed as. That, honestly, is what disturbed me more than if she'd meant it cruelly. She'd simply stopped thinking of me as close enough to matter. I told the waiter it was fine. I meant it, in the narrow sense that I genuinely didn't want to make a scene at Carol's birthday. But something in me, quietly and permanently, recalibrated in that exact moment. Carol reached under the table and found my hand. Neither of us said anything. Danny still hadn't looked up from his plate. I didn't confront Priya that night, or the next week, or the week after that. I want to explain why, because I think it matters as much as anything else in this story. If I'd said something in the moment, if I'd corrected her, or worse, brought up the loan as some kind of trump card to prove my own significance, it would have become exactly the kind of ugly confrontation that gives someone like Priya a story to tell afterward. One where I'm the wounded old man weaponizing money to demand affection. I didn't want to win an argument. I wanted clarity, for myself as much as for anyone else, about exactly what role I actually wanted to keep playing in a family that had quietly decided I was optional. So instead, I called my attorney, a careful, understated woman named Diane Whitfield, who'd handled my business affairs for almost 15 years. I asked her to walk me through my actual legal position on that co-signed loan, not to punish Danny, but because I realized, sitting with that dinner for a few days, that I'd extended myself financially into a family relationship that had just, quite plainly, told me I wasn't really part of it. Diane explained that as a co-signer, I held no direct operational control over the restaurant. But I did hold specific rights under the loan agreement, including a clause, standard for this kind of guarantor arrangement, requiring the primary borrowers to maintain a certain debt service coverage ratio and to notify me of any material changes to the business's financial structure. It was boilerplate language neither Danny nor Priya had probably ever read closely, the kind of clause that exists specifically for situations exactly like the one I now found myself in. I also asked Diane something else. Something I'd been turning over quietly since that dinner. What would happen, structurally, if I simply declined to renew my guarantor status when the loan came up for its annual review in 5 weeks? Not calling the loan due early, not sabotaging anything. Simply declining to continue voluntarily underwriting a business relationship with people who'd made it clear, without ever intending to be so blunt about it, that I wasn't considered close enough to matter. Diane didn't push me toward any particular decision. She simply laid out the mechanics clearly and told me I had every right to make whatever choice reflected how I actually wanted to be treated going forward. I want to walk through those 5 weeks carefully because I think the quiet of them says more than any dramatic confrontation could have. I didn't withdraw from the family. I still called Danny weekly, the way I always had. I still saw Carol soften every time his name came up on my phone, still relieved, the way mothers are, that her son still called his parents at all. I didn't mention the loan review. I didn't mention the dinner. I simply let the ordinary rhythm of our relationship continue, while quietly, internally, weighing what I actually wanted the next chapter of it to look like. During that time, I learned some things I hadn't fully understood before. Danny mentioned, almost in passing during one of our calls, that Priya's family, the connections she'd credited with the downtown location's turnaround, had actually pulled back their involvement months earlier, frustrated by what her father apparently called throwing good money after a location that should have been killed after the construction delays. The financing structure sorted properly Priya had bragged about at dinner wasn't her family's doing at all. It was, in every practical sense, still resting almost entirely on my signature. I sat with that information for a long time. I want to be honest. Some part of me wanted to feel vindicated by it. Wanted to feel the satisfaction of quietly knowing I was the actual foundation underneath a story she'd rewritten to exclude me. But mostly, I just felt tired. Tired of being useful in the ways that were convenient and invisible in the ways that mattered. Around the 4th week, Danny called me sounding different than usual. Quieter. More hesitant. He told me, without my asking, that things with Priya had been tense lately, that she'd been under enormous stress from the business, that he'd tried, gently, to raise the idea of formally thanking me at some point for the loan, and she'd shut the conversation down almost immediately, insisting it would complicate things if I felt more entitled to a say in how the restaurant was run. I asked him, as neutrally as I could manage, what he thought more entitled to a say actually meant, given that I already legally held real say as the loan's guarantor, whether anyone acknowledged it socially or not. He didn't have a good answer. I think for the first time, he was starting to see the shape of what I'd been quietly noticing for months. The annual guarantor review arrived exactly on schedule 5 weeks after that dinner. Diane had prepared the standard renewal paperwork, the kind of routine administrative formality that, in an ordinary year, I would have signed without a second thought. I asked Danny to meet me for coffee, alone, without Priya, the way he'd originally come to me 6 months earlier. I told him the truth, plainly and without cruelty. I wasn't going to renew my guarantor status on the loan. Not because I wanted to punish him, and not because I doubted the restaurant's viability. The numbers, in fact, looked genuinely healthier than they had 6 months earlier. I told him I simply couldn't continue quietly underwriting the financial security of a household that had made it clear, without meaning to be so explicit about it, that I wasn't considered close enough to be trusted with that same security socially. Danny went very pale. He asked what would happen to the loan if I withdrew as guarantor. I told him the honest, uncomfortable truth. Without my signature, the bank would almost certainly require them to either secure alternative collateral, bring in a new qualified guarantor, or risk the loan being called for review under less favorable terms. It wasn't a bluff, and I made sure he understood that. It was simply me declining to continue a private arrangement that had never been publicly honored in the first place. He asked quietly if there was anything he could do. I told him the truth. This decision wasn't really about him at all. Not entirely. It was about a dinner, and a comment made almost carelessly, and a slow pattern of exclusion that had finally crossed a line I hadn't fully realized existed until I felt it land. I told him I loved him completely, and that this had nothing to do with cutting him out of my life. It had everything to do with no longer being willing to be treated as disposable while quietly functioning as indispensable. Danny told Priya that same week. I wasn't there for that conversation, and I've never asked for every detail of how it went because I think some conversations between a husband and wife aren't meant to be fully known by anyone else, even a father who was, in a real sense, the subject of them. What I do know is that Priya called me directly about 10 days later. The first time, I realized with some discomfort that she'd ever called me on her own initiative rather than simply being present when Danny called. She was, to her credit, more honest than I expected. She admitted she hadn't fully understood the extent of my involvement in the loan, that Danny had, out of his own fear of her reaction, kept most of the financial details vague even with her. She apologized somewhat stiffly for the comment at dinner, explaining, not entirely convincingly, that she'd simply been thinking about the check in narrow financial terms and hadn't meant anything larger by it. I told her honestly that I believed she probably hadn't consciously intended the comment as cruelty. But I also told her that unintended carelessness, repeated often enough across enough small moments, eventually becomes its own kind of message, whether or not it was ever meant that way. I told her I wasn't interested in an apology that simply smoothed over the moment so things could return to exactly how they'd been. I told her gently but clearly that if she wanted me to remain financially involved in their business in any capacity going forward, it would need to come with an actual, ongoing acknowledgement of that involvement. Not gratitude performed for an audience, just an honest, quiet correction to a story that had, until now, written me almost entirely out of it. We didn't resolve everything on that phone call. I don't think relationships like this resolve in a single conversation, and I've learned to be suspicious of stories that claim they do. But something shifted. Danny and Priya together ultimately secured a new co-guarantor arrangement through a business partner rather than asking me to renew, which I want to be clear I fully supported, since it finally gave the arrangement an honesty it had lacked before. I stepped back from the loan entirely, cleanly, on terms everyone understood clearly this time. 6 months later, Danny and Priya's restaurants are doing well, genuinely, on their own footing, without my signature quietly propping anything up. Danny calls more often now, and there's something different in how he introduces me to new people in his life. Less, my dad, delivered flatly. More something warmer, more specific. Though I've never made a point of naming the difference out loud. Priya and I aren't close, not the way I once hoped we might become. But we're honest with each other now, in a way we weren't before that dinner. She's stopped, as far as I can tell, drawing quiet lines around who counts as real family in front of waiters and strangers. Whether that's from genuine reflection or simple caution, I've decided I don't need to know for certain. Some repairs don't need a fully excavated motive to still be worth accepting. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from this story, it's this. You don't have to raise your voice or deliver some dramatic ultimatum to correct a family that's quietly decided you're optional. Sometimes the clearest way to be taken seriously is simply to stop quietly absorbing the cost of being treated as though you don't matter, and let the people around you feel, honestly and without manipulation, exactly what that absence looks like in practice. I never wanted power over my son's business. I only ever wanted to matter as much in the room as I apparently mattered on paper. It turns out you can't demand that kind of recognition. You can only quietly and firmly stop paying for the privilege of being denied it. If this story hit home for you, you're not alone. And there are more like it every week. Subscribe and tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to quietly step back from a family that stopped treating you like you belonged? I read every single one.